Welcome everyone to this webinar about cybersecurity and investing in a safer digital future. I'm joined, my name is Stephen Fraser. I'm the online editor and technology writer at Shares Magazine, and I'm joined today in the studio by Howie Lee, who is from the asset manager that recently launched Europe's first cybersecurity specific ETF. And from over the pond, we are also joined by Christian Magoon. Christian was a consultant with the International Securities Exchange and was behind setting up the first ever benchmark that specifically tracks cybersecurity companies. Hello, Christian, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Pleasure to be joining you today.
Great stuff. We'll just go through a couple of issues beforehand. It'd be great if our audience participate in this event as much as possible. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A section. So we'd love you to send in any questions to us, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible. And you can do this by just submitting the question on the GoToWebinar control panel. The process from there is fairly straightforward. But bear in mind that this whole event will be recorded and stored live with the slides, which you'll be able to download and look at your leisure after the event has finished. So to open up, we can't really talk about cybersecurity at the moment without talking about TalkTalk. Now, what may have started as an intellectual game of chess, if you like, with some geeks in bedrooms and so on, has clearly grown to something significantly more than that. This latest incident with TalkTalk, 4 million plus customers, personal details and bank account data compromised. We still don't know the details of just to what extent that compromise has happened. But to put that into some kind of context, in 2013 we had a retailer in the US, Target, that was targeted by a similar event that attacked 40 million customers. Credit card details were stolen and people did lose money. That effectively cost their CEO, Greg Steinhafel, his job. So just looking back briefly, before we get to the meat of the conversation, in 2002 Gartner put out a survey where they anticipated a fairly anemic proposition in the cybersecurity space, looking at a market worth about $3.5 billion, and dominated by the 5 existing companies then: Symantec, IBM, Network Associates, Trend Micro, and Checkpoint. We have seen an explosion in new threats, new products to meet those threats. But this is clearly a very big growth opportunity, both in terms of the hacking threat and in terms of how we defend ourselves against that threat. Howie, how would you like to put into context how big this market opportunity is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to put this issue, to highlight the scale of the problem here for cybersecurity. We'll take a look at some headlines that we've seen in the press over the past few months. As you mentioned, Stephen, you can't miss what's happened in the last week or so with TalkTalk. As you said, 4 million customers' accounts were compromised in the cyber attack. And look what happened to its company valuation. We saw that fall by 669 million in under 1 week. That's a very big amount for a company of TalkTalk size. We look at what else happened on the government side in the US. The Office of Personnel Management and the Interior Department was hacked back in June 2015. The personal details of 4 million US government employees were stolen. Now that can be used for a number of purposes, and clearly this is not just attacking companies, this is also attacking governments as well. Another high-profile one that came aboard late last year, Sony. Back in November 2014, people hacked confidential information and releasing personal details and communications from Sony employees to the media. At the end, Sony agreed in the U.S. District Court to pay up $8 million in compensation to its employees. This is a cost to Sony as a business as well. You've got some more social sites that got some airtime over the summer, Ashley Madison, a dating website for married people, where there were about 30 million members where their personal details were exposed. And that's, for a website that banks on confidentiality, that is also a big issue that's begging for a solution. And last but not least, another example would be Carphone Warehouse back in August 2015. Very well-known high street brand here in the UK, personal details of 2.4 million customers, including credit card details of up to 90,000 customers were compromised. Again, this gives you a overview of how this is attacking companies, how this is attacking governments, but also individuals linked to the services that they use each and every day. Perhaps I might pass it on to Christian here. You might have some views on highlighting the global cost of cybercrime, Christian.
Yes, thanks, Howie. What's amazing about the global cost of cybercrime is that it's now approaching close to $500 billion. In fact, the latest study in 2014 put estimates at $400 billion. Now we're talking about cybercrime. Keep in mind, this is talking about areas like corporations being hacked, individuals being hacked, their identities being stolen, and government information being taken as well. Estimates are that this number is actually expected to go quite a bit, perhaps as much as 15% going into next year, and we anticipate having that latest estimate out soon, partly because of many of the incidents we've heard about over the last year specifically that Howie outlined, not just in the corporate side, but also in the government side. We're seeing an amazing amount of players in this whole cyber threat area, everything from hobbyists, which some people immediately think of the hacking community, to groups that are associated with terrorist organizations or who are part of activist organizations, as well as traditional criminals. And then finally, probably the big elephant in the room, these state-sponsored groups, which have been involved with a number of very high-profile attacks. Certainly we're seeing some state-sponsored activity from countries as diverse as China, Russia, and North Korea. If we go to the next slide, you can actually take a look at how each country is being affected from an estimate standpoint when looking at cybercrime as a percentage of GDP. I'm participating today in the webinar from New York, and you can see in the United States we have really one of the highest rates by far of cybercrime impacting GDP. And as you know, the United States has a fairly large GDP. Incidentally, one of the other largest GDPs in the world is China, and you can see that they're right behind the U.S. in cybercrime as a percentage of GDP. Looking closely at Europe, the United Kingdom is fairly high in terms of a number as well. Certainly a few other countries being victimized. The point is, this is a global trend, and as digital economy and data storage and use of devices continues to grow, this is an issue, cybersecurity and cybercrime, that's not going away, and is being looked at now by major organizations, whether that's governments and corporations, as well as individuals, as one of the kind of the biggest areas to combat as we go further into the future. How I think you have some more headlines that talks a little bit more about the problem in detail.
Yeah, and absolutely. And what I'm trying to lean off here is try to highlight the fact that we've reached a turning point where companies, governments, and individuals are here to fight back. So for the first time ever, the Office of National Statistics here in the UK have included cybercrime figures for the first time in 2015. And over 2.5 million incidents were reported in England and Wales in the past year. And of course, that is forecast to increase. You look at the US government, they spent $100 billion on cybersecurity over the past decade, and they've now budgeted $14 billion for cybersecurity in 2016. That's had effects on the cyber insurance market. Granted, that's mainly seen in the US at the moment, but that's grown from 1 billion to a 2.5 billion business in the past 2 years. I mean, that's a pretty significant rate of growth within the insurance market. And of course, with all of us using mobile or phones so much, that security market is also projected to grow as we use our smartphones, tablets, and mobile devices more and more, both in our everyday lives personally, but also in the workplace.
We also are seeing a greater demand for opportunities from the investment community as well. It was interesting, in July, we had one of the biggest technology floats on the UK market in terms of the company called Sophos. Now, Sophos is a network and end-user security specialist, and it came to the market with a £1 billion market cap. Now, one analyst told me that that was not only the biggest cybersecurity float in the UK, it was the biggest technology float in the UK that he could remember. There's significant appetite, but unfortunately there seems to be a lack of supply. We are seeing a smattering of small companies across the UK space, NCC and GB Group and Interseed and SQS and a few other small companies, but we are lacking that opportunity here. And it's clear to me that investors need to take a much wider view of this global industry. We can't be parochial in our thinking. And that's an interesting opportunity for us to not get bogged down in this sense of fear. This is a great opportunity about increasing communication, increasing our level of education, and increasing our ability to tap into a big investment opportunity. One of the experts I know, Richard Holway of the Tech Market Views website, when speaking about the Sophos IPO, he flagged up the importance of these kind of IPOs because they create ecosystems of entrepreneurs, of analysts, of specialised investors. So that's a really good sign from the UK's point of view that this is a burgeoning market. But putting into a context, how big is this investment opportunity? Howard, do you have some data on that?
Yeah, no, we absolutely do. I mean, certainly from our side, the global, looking at some of the stats that's publicly available out there, the global cybersecurity market is forecasted to grow at a compound annual rate of 10% to 170 billion by 2020. So that's what's expected for us to experience in the next 5 years. And another stat that's going back to one of the Gartner reports is, they predict that by 2018, more than half of organizations will use security service firms that specialize particularly in cybersecurity safety. I know, Christian, we've talked in the past about what the growth rate in the reported cybercrimes have been and what the drivers of growth are for this sector. So perhaps you might want to give us a little bit more color on that.
Yes, exactly, Howie. The growth rate is unfortunately astounding of cybersecurity incidents, and this is just the reported ones. So keep in mind, many governments and corporations are not always forthcoming about reporting any cybersecurity threats or incidents. So the 66% growth per year going back to 2009, that rate continues to be troubling. And again, it's only on this rate only includes reported cybersecurity incidents. And as you know, even we've seen in the United Kingdom with TalkTalk, there's a pretty negative stigma in the marketplace, even in the capital markets, about reporting a widespread data breach or cyber threat. So this is probably underestimates what's really happening in the corporate and the world of government. It's a trend that just continues to grow for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about it a little later, but the fact that, as Steve mentioned, we're in this era of globalization, and how are we all connected? We're connected through the internet, through these data streams, through the cloud, and that has brought about more temptation for cyber criminals, terrorists, even state-sponsored organizations to really spend time trying to figure out how to unlock and access information they're not supposed to. That combined with cheaper technology, both in terms of mobile devices as well as computing power, has really kind of accelerated this growth. You can even see in the most recent comparison going from 2013 to 2014 on this graph, the large amount of increased attacks. We expect it to be even higher in 2015. Certainly the headlines point to that. So this is an area that really tends to, unfortunately, look like it's going to grow quite a bit. So if we go to the next slide, what are really the growth drivers of cybersecurity? We mentioned them a little bit just briefly, but essentially there's more targets. As governments, corporations, and individuals begin to rely more so on electronic infrastructure, there's simply more targets out there for bad actors to try to access. Secondly, the methods are changing. Most of us are familiar with some of the email scams or some of the Wi-Fi type attacks. Each month we're seeing a different type of method start to evolve across many different platforms, and that really creates kind of this cat and mouse game between cybersecurity companies and hackers. Finally, the damages and the damages for corporations and governments, as well as the rewards for bad actors, have all increased dramatically. So when we look here, for example, in the United States, we mentioned before that over $100 billion has been spent by the U.S. government for cybersecurity, yet this year hackers accessed the Social Security records of more than 4 million Americans. They accessed the personal information, including fingerprints of millions of U.S. government workers, and believe it or not, the acting head of the Central Intelligence Agency had his email hacked by a teenager in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So there is unbelievable amount of different activity that's being effective by all sorts of actors, again, hobbyists to terrorist organizations, even in spite of, for example, the U.S. government spending $100 billion trying to secure their networks and data. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that what I think is interesting is that cybersecurity is not just a growth area, but there's some unique twists, and the twists really set this area apart. First, it's a growth industry, but it's a growth industry that's become an essential spend. Sometimes we think of growth areas of the market, whether that could be maybe social media spending or digital devices, as kind of discretionary. Cybersecurity really isn't that. It has to be an essential building block today, which means that cybersecurity has a certain amount of defensiveness that is spending involved there. Regardless of interest rates, inflation, economic cycles, corporations, governments, even individuals must spend on this. So it adds a certain measure, again, of defensiveness to this growth play. Secondly, the customer base for this industry is very diverse. In many, for example, technology industries, you see consumers ruling the roost. If you think of a company like Apple, where people are buying MacBooks and iPhones and iPads, and it's really about the consumer appetite for those devices. Cybersecurity is very different in the sense that there's considerable demand from corporations as well as governments because of the nature of their sensitive information. Additionally, individuals are becoming increasingly interested in cybersecurity. Certainly just looking at some of the photo hacks or social media hacks that have happened over the past year or two, you can think of many people who really would like to secure that personal information. Finally, because of the essential nature of cybersecurity spending and its diverse customer base, cybersecurity companies are kind of the belle of the ball. They're very attractive to larger scale defense and technology companies as potential merger and acquisition targets. It's very hard to build your own solution, security solution from the ground up. It's much easier to instead of to actually purchase that and integrate it into your large-scale platform. And this is an area that has high growth for corporations, as well as kind of this all-weather type demand. So cybersecurity presents kind of an interesting dynamic when you start to think of some of these companies perhaps being acquired by larger scale technology and defense companies going forward. So those are kind of a unique aspects of kind of the growth story behind cybersecurity. Really simply put, if we go to the next slide, the investment case for cybersecurity is that increased cyber threats, risks, awareness, and spending are bullish for companies focused on cybersecurity, not only the hardware, the software, but also the services. And I think that really summarizes kind of the overall investment case for cybersecurity, Howie.